I'll just invite everybody to find their seats. I know food is always a tempting one to get these days, but no, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Robin Guy. I'm the Vice President and Deputy Leader, Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to kick off the second half of today's event by introducing you to this afternoon's panel, where we're joined by business leaders from across sectors to explore Canada's 2030 and 2050 carbon targets. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, Etienne Rainville, Director of Federal Government Relations of Clean Prosperity, Robert Cummings, Vice President, Sustainability and Public Affairs at Lafarge, and Rebecca Francolini, Senior Environmental Strategist at Mackenzie Investments, and last but certainly not least, Shelley Gilberg, National ESG Markets Leader and Canadian Platform Leader at PwC Canada. We're also joined by Sam Bejuvis. Yes. VP Government Relations and Multilateral Institutions at S&C-Lavalin Group, who will be moderating today's discussion, and I'll turn things over to now. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for taking the time to be here today, either in person or virtually, to hear from all sorts of leaders from across different sectors of the Canadian economy to talk about Canada's 2030, 2035, 2050 carbon objectives. Today, on this panel, we'll discuss whether the current federal policy landscape facilitates private sector investment towards decarbonization, and to provide some insights on how Canada can advance environmental and economic ambitions together in tandem. We have a lot to get to. For this next 57 minutes, our most precious commodity is time. And we'll try to drill down on the ERP 1 year in, net zero investments, sector pathways, carbon pricing if we dare, renewable energy, workforce development, global impact, and hopefully we'll end off on a look ahead. We'll really try to get that as to be the last question. So without further delay, let's get started, shall we? And let's just ask the same question that Heather Chalmers asked of Aaron Corey. How do you think things are going 1 year in with the ERP? If you dare, make a comment on, are we going to meet the target? Are we on track to meet the target? What do we need to do in order to accelerate matters? And why don't we start with Rebecca from Mackenzie Investments? Thanks.
Oh, you put me on the hot spot by being the first one to go. But yeah, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here in person with everybody as well. And as many of us know, so Canada's 2030 emissions reductions plan not only has several ambitious 2030 targets, but there are also some aggressive 2030 targets. And for us in the investment universe, it's a great starting point for Canada, but there's a lot of key points that are missing within it, from understanding the so what and the how, not only as an investor and an asset manager, but also for a number of our investee companies. So when we're looking at this, the reduction plan describes how Canada expects to meet its international climate commitments by achieving that emission target of between 40 to 45% below our 2005 levels by 2030, and also includes a $9.1 billion investment to cut pollution and grow the economy. And if we're looking at this in comparison to the IRA, which I know we're going to get to in a little bit, Canada would need to spend at least around $12 billion a year to meet a 10% anticipated annual emission cut. So if you put that into a perspective, there's a massive gap of what we're going to do from a private investment side, as well as understanding, okay, how does Canada stand up to par against the United States, against what's going on in Europe? And as a global asset manager, makes things quite tricky for us to be able to understand, okay, what do we do? What do we recommend for our investee companies and for our portfolio managers? And what's the right thing to do in this space? And maybe what's the wrong thing to do in this space? Another thing for us as well is understanding the incentives, as well as how do we tackle the high emitters? So specifically the oil and gas space, when we are a Canadian investee company, an asset manager. And again, we want to fuel economic growth in Canada. We don't just want to cut off the oil and gas industry. So we need to understand, okay, where do we funnel our investments? And how does this fit into Canada's emission reduction plan? Those are some of the key gaps that we see there for us.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that investment perspective. Rob, you work for Lafarge, very important component of the infrastructure sector. what's your perspective on how we're doing with respect to ERP in the last year towards the targets?
Thanks, Sam. And we're very excited about that $2 trillion of investment coming our way. So looking forward to that. We are in a unique position in our sector that we're 80% of our emissions are scope 1. Scope 2 and 3 are relatively minor for us. So we're different boat than most of you. So I hope I can give you a bit of a different perspective from our point of view. In the last couple of years with the SIF and ZA program and other programs that have been announced under the emissions reduction program from the federal government, and also initiatives from provincial governments as well, that has spawned a lot of interest in projects. Now, I think it was said earlier that these projects don't happen in 1 or 2 years. So underneath the ground right now, there's a lot of activity. I know our entire sector has projects in front of the federal government right now, representing billions and billions of dollars of investment, foreign investment in most cases as well. So we are in the position where I think in the next 2 or 3 years, that's going to get constructed, and we're going to start seeing the benefits of that and have a significant dent. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but that investment depends on 2 things remaining in place: a firm carbon pricing system that we are justifying the projects on, and the financial support from the various programs, the revenue recycling from the cap and trade program, for example. And that's what we're going to be watching very closely today in the budget.
Thanks, Rob, for that industrial perspective. Shelley, co-chair, PwC co-chair of the Chamber's Net Zero Executive Council. What's your perspective from where you sit PricewaterhouseCoopers over the last year?
I'm going to start with something horribly depressing, which is no, I don't think it's on track at all. I think if you look at that 2 trillion, it's front end loaded, and we haven't front end loaded it, number one. Number two, I think despite the amount of private capital that's looking for a place to go, I think in the absence of policy certainty, we have locked up a bunch of capital that would be available to move us forward. And 3, I think if you look at the real economy versus the investment economy, that Canada's been behind already. So we are not starting from the same place everybody else is. And so we have some wonderful things that are in Canada's favor, right? We have a natural resources balance sheet that's unbelievable, but the ability to do that, and we spoke about this morning, I think Confederation hurts us in this way too. So the need to collaborate and try and integrate times 14 is very difficult when you look at the size of the Canadian economy, you multiply that with geography, and you look at where we are. I'm really hopeful. So one of the things that's been a concern to me in the last year, and Aaron alluded to this, is where do you start to get incentives or gap fillers for things that don't have a natural market incentive? Because you need to move them from point A to point B in order for them to scale. And I think we're starting to see what I'll call more sophisticated levers come into play, which I think is encouraging.
Thank you. You started off and then came back to encouraging. That's really good. Etienne, what about a final comment on this question from Clean Prosperity? Thanks.
Yeah, I would echo that a little bit, but remove a tiny bit of the pessimism just to say that the ERP itself was a strategy. And what was really nice about it was that it provided the sector by sector emissions breakdown and gave folks in those sectors a sense of how far and how fast they were expected to move from the federal perspective. But ultimately, the ERP and the 2030 goal is kind of like a midterm exam. You don't need to necessarily pass it. You just really need to try hard and do your best, because the final exam, being net zero by 2050, is the ultimate objective. So Canada needs to move far and fast, and we need to study really, really hard for 2030. But just because we don't hit what's comparably ambitious goal of 40 to 45%, which was laid out in our nationally determined contribution, that doesn't mean we should despair. It means we need to keep trying, and we need to look at the next objective, being 2050.
Thank you. On top of all that, we, in the excellent interview with Aaron Corey with Heather, Aaron brought up this competition. We are facing competition. And I just want to lay it right out on the table, that which will not speak its name. The US IRA is our competition, and it's potentially draining investments. So what do we do to try, in the face of an incredibly large investment for the United States to try to get really on track with its own clean energy objectives, which has had obviously had unintended consequences on Canada? What should we do? How should we do it in order to try and compete and to maintain investment in Canada to try to reach the target by 2050? And let's start with Shelley.
So what's interesting about the IRA is I think sometimes we as Canadians need to be galvanized by something else. And I think the IRA is helpful in that it gives us something to look at. Do we need the exact same thing? No, but it makes it very tangible. So when we look at how are we going to create competitive, whether you want to consider them advantages or removal of competitive disadvantages for Canada, I think that speaks to scale. I think that speaks to the Team Canada approach that Heather talked about earlier, is you have to bulk up and fight up a weight class. And that I think we've shown that we know how to do when we're looking at a threat that's outside. So I think that gives us some roadmap, Sam, in terms of what kind of a mental attitude we need to bring to the competitiveness.
Thank you. Let's go with the investment sector. Rebecca, do you have a perspective on this in terms of how do we continue to attract that money into Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in Canada, at Mackenzie, we've been kind of saying it's a made in Canada approach that we need. So it's been great. And if we look at Canadian policy, a lot of the time we kind of take the back end and we don't take kind of that first mover approach. We wait often for something to happen. And with the IRA coming out, it's a great platform for us to model against slightly, but again, take that Canadian perspective. Specifically on the investment side, we're seeing that there's a lot of great momentum coming out of this, whether it's kind of that new partnership that's come out with the US and Canada talking about the energy transformation task force that they're putting forward, or even the Canadian taxonomy roadmap that came out a few weeks ago, which for us in the investment space is very important because it helps us understand, okay, where should private investment be crowded and where should it be funneled? And rather than just focused on the green side of things, we also need to focus on those transition elements. And it helps us understand, okay, as an investor, this is what maybe companies in Canada are going to start to look at. And it gives us, although it's proposed right now per se, it gives us a little bit more of a guidance and a roadmap of where to go, rather than us kind of just saying, okay, if we're going to your midterm example, saying, okay, I'm going to just read through the whole textbook because my professor isn't helping me and isn't teaching me, or I'm going to sit there and wait for the week before the midterm for them to release the study guide, right? So it's either you go ahead and you move forward and you do stuff and you hope that you're aligned with what's going to come out, or you take a little bit of a back end approach and you say, okay, I'm going to wait to have all the guidance that I need. And we know 2030 is coming around very, very quickly. Are we going to meet things in 2030? I would hope so, but probably not likely. But you can't just sit around and wait for something to be there. But the taxonomy is a great first roadmap. And then also for us in the investment industry, disclosure and transparency has become a massive aspect. And we're seeing a lot of that be leaned into in Canada as well as in the United States. So, that's not necessarily in the IRA, but it's a great first step for us because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So
at the risk of kind of aging myself, it's kind of like the Coles notes of 2050. Anyway, moving on to carbon. No one laughed. That just goes to show how old I am. Moving to carbon pricing, Rob, you and I had a brief discussion this morning about carbon pricing and accounting. It's important. The Liberal NDP entente lasts until 2025. Carbon pricing could be back on the agenda within a couple of years. I'd like your perspective from the Lafarge point of view on carbon pricing system that exists today. And is there anything that we should do to improve the price signaling in the marketplace with respect to the existing carbon price system we've got?
Yeah, sure. Let me tell you a story first. There I was 6 years ago in my office watching an email arrive that Doug Ford had just withdrawn from the cap and trade program with Quebec and California. And California read the same information through the press. That's how they knew it happened. And within an hour or two, they had to shut off all the financial instruments between Quebec and Ontario. So that's a real issue. We had a $50 million project that basically got canceled that day as well. No one believed it was possible, that there's no way he would do something so quick as that. So with a new potential government coming in, if it is a majority conservative government, there is indeed a risk. And I'm going to go so far as to say that the fuel levy on gasoline and diesel will likely be taken away. However, I do think the output-based pricing system on large final emitters will likely stay because that seems to be a fairly common Conservative Party approach throughout the provinces. And I think in terms of price signal, cap and trade system with its ever increasing price and ever decreasing benchmarks will create a drive over time over the next decade because high carbon products will be more expensive than low carbon products over time. But if you really want to accelerate it, it's not enough because we want to sell low carbon cement and concrete today, and our customers will not buy it for a variety of reasons, including government. And so we need to change the rules around some of that so that we can get our low carbon products out into the economy and not just end up having to pay a carbon tax because our customers won't buy our low carbon products.
Thank you. And what about the view from Clean Prosperity, Etienne, about the carbon pricing system we've got in place and what may happen?
Yeah, so the political rhetoric around carbon pricing is a little hard to parse. And I think a lot of people get confused in terms of the general population between the price on consumer fuels that you pay at the pump and that the stickers that Doug Ford put on the pumps were about, which is what ostensibly Poilievre is talking about when he talks about axing the carbon tax. But the other side is the OBPS system and the way industrial emitters factor into it. And no one really knows what the Conservatives intend to do. There isn't a lot of information. It really depends which MP you talk to. They'll kind of give you their personal views on whether or not they like it. And there's a whole multitude of thinking. So I would say that that question is still very much in the air, and it's an opportunity for industry to go in and talk to the Conservatives and to tell them why it's valuable, why it should be maintained. Because by no means, I would say, is it predetermined that it'll be here in 2 years or 3 years, depending on when the next election is. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's certainly likely to exist 3 to 5 years from now, at least in the form it is today. But it's really an opportunity for the sector. It's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is trying to preach about the value of the OBPS system and how it unlocks decarbonization investments for the Canadian economy.
Thank you. Great comment. The Net Zero Council of the Chamber is focused this year on the workforce development and transition. And so I'd love to ask a question of the panelists related to, it's projected that 15% of the labor force will be disrupted over the next 10 years as the country transitions towards net zero economy, let's call it that. So how can we ensure that the workforce of the future is not left behind in this transition? And how can we ensure that the transition is also inclusive and equitable? And why don't we start with Rebecca on that one?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I think it's also a very tricky question for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, because right now, when we're looking at a lot of climate action plans from companies or from governments, a lot of things are focused and structured around emissions. And I think we all kind of get this silo effect where we're focusing on, okay, how do we get these reductions to happen? But ultimately, countries are built off of people. If we want any of this technology to come to fruition, it ultimately is going to rely, yes, on getting money there, but also on the people, right? And so I know there's lots of research out there about how a transition to a low carbon economy could bring up to 24 million new jobs by 2030. But we also have to remember that those are also going to be a loss of about 6 million jobs, specifically in energy related spaces. And so when we're looking at policy specifically from an investment lens, we need to understand, okay, what are the great opportunities, but also what are the risks, and how do we help our investee companies manage for these risks? And that's kind of a big gap of what we see in the policy, is that there needs to also be an assessment of, okay, these are the areas that are going to grow and where we want to funnel new workforces and make sure that we have the training there. But also, what are those key areas of individuals who are the most vulnerable, who are the most at risk? Yes, it's going to be energy related workers and some of those companies, but we also need to understand, okay, how are the Indigenous populations being impacted? How are the communities up north going to be impacted, right? As climate change continues to happen, as we need to get the infrastructure out there, right? We need to make sure that things are done in an equal way, considering equality out there as well, because these areas do they deserve to be able to have access to the same things that everyone has access to, right? So I think there's a lot more complex issues when it comes to thinking about this. And there's going to be great things that come out of the transition, but I think it's going to ultimately be very difficult. And on the climate action side for investors, that just transition piece is really being left to kind of the back end, because everyone's focusing on, okay, what can we do for our emission reductions now? And less, okay, we're going to wait and see what happens to our workers. So we're kind of in this weird lagging space too, where we don't have a lot of guidance of what to do on our end.
Thanks, Rebecca. Very interested in the industry perspective. Rob, do you have a perspective from the Lafarge point of view with respect to workforce of the future as you transition?
Oh, absolutely. If anyone's looking for work, we need drivers. We need all sorts of mechanics.
Amen, brother.
It doesn't matter whether it's green or not. It's going to be the same ready mix truck delivering zero carbon concrete, right? Then we need drivers for our concrete trucks. So we have calls for interviews. 40 people will sign up and one person will show up. So for us, it's kind of the opposite. I know there will be some changes in the economy. I think anyone who's working from home full time, you're at risk, because with globalization, we can hire people from South America quite easily for those jobs. So that's where I think the risks are for many people. We need to get more people into skilled trades. We need more immigration. I think it used to be 5 people working for every retired person. It's now 2.5 working for every retired person, going to go to 2 in the next 10 years. So that 500,000 people coming into our country every year is a good thing. It's going to pull it out for us. So from our perspective, it's the green transition will happen. I think the oil sands jobs will transition to different kinds of jobs over time, and they're not going away for quite some time. I think there is some danger in talking about the just transition for oil fields employees. I'm going out on a limb here. Seamus O'Regan was the one that told us this, that it kind of gives across the idea that what the work they're doing is dirty and unwelcome and not something we want in our country, when these people are providing such an important service for our country. So when we have to be careful with the language we use. And I think over time, people will move. There's a huge transition from Atlantic Canada to Alberta. Now there's a transition going back. So these things can happen over time. We just have to remove barriers, provide lots of training, bring in immigration, and hopefully we'll have a ready mix driver this coming summer.
Sam, if I can, I think
Please.
there's one thing that sometimes gets lost in the whole skills transition, which is the amount of time it takes to transition workforces, right? So when you think about that, like that needs to be structural, it needs to be systemic. The second thing that worries me a little bit as a Canadian, we don't have a lot of manufacturing capability. So I think about earnings per year on those jobs that are going to change. And if we don't have production capabilities, you don't take people from making $120,000 a year, $140,000 a year in the oil field into tech jobs or other jobs. And I think that's a big nut for us to crack. When you think about what I would call an orderly and inclusive transition, it means that Canadians can afford to pay for the energy that they're going to be consuming that will be more expensive in a new world, that they're able to handle inflation. And I think that's sort of an undiscussed subject sometimes of we don't necessarily have not Aaron's infrastructure necessarily, but the production capabilities in Canada that make those high quality, high earning jobs.
Thank you. A great sort of human approach. Just from SNC's perspective as an engineering company, the transition is now. We need engineers. We need a lot of engineers, not just in the nuclear space, but across the entire engineering space. We even need economists with economic backgrounds. So we need all sorts of people right here, right now. Moving to the global, right now, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are about 1.6% of total global emissions. At the same time, we're one of the largest emitters, obviously, for a number of reasons, geography mostly. With these stats in mind for all panelists, but let's maybe start with Shelley on this one. What's the role for Canada in supporting international transitions towards net zero? Thanks.
Boy, not everybody will agree with what I'm going to say. But I see this not dissimilar to the role that Canada played for years in peacekeeping missions. Like, we play a role that's different than just for ourselves. And we've done that in so many contexts as a country. So we are blessed with a set of natural resources. We are blessed with the ability to mine critical minerals, safely, conflict-free, without human impacts. That I think some people would say we have a huge role to play. I would say we have a role that's outsized to our economy to play. I think we have a global responsibility to use that natural balance sheet to help create energy security, to help create a transition that is orderly and inclusive for other countries. And the example I often give is, I don't support an energy transition that sees girls and women in developing countries go back 40 years and be sold into marriage because of energy poverty. So as we transition and we think about how do you bring the whole globe along, I think Canada can play a much bigger role in that than just for ourselves.
Thank you. Etienne, clean prosperity, your perspective?
Yeah, I would really just build on that. As a G7 and a G20 country, it's clear that Canada has kind of a global leadership role to play. But there's two other pieces. There's the equity piece that is certainly worth talking about. But there's also the business angle that Canada can be self-interested in terms of, like, if we're calling it a clean tech arms race, that we can draw that capital to Canada for our own benefits, build the value chains in Canada, and then export that technology. CANDO is kind of an example from a number of years ago where it was made in Canada technology that we build and develop domestically, and then we started exporting it internationally to help other regions of the world, often the global south, have access to clean or low carbon energy fairly cheaply. So that's kind of an example from a generation ago, let's say. But there's many, many more examples of that are playing out today, be it in the nuclear space with the players who are coming in, Moltex in New Brunswick and some of the more experimental SMRs, or in the hydrogen space, or in clean cement or low carbon cement. There's really a story like that in every single sector of the economy as it's trying to decarbonize. And so there's opportunities in each and every one of those if we stand up and we seize them. And often that's supported by policy at the federal level that makes Canada a destination for that kind of investment, be it certainty around the carbon pricing system or other ITCs, PTCs, whatever the incentive mix the Canadian government pursues is.
Thanks, Etienne. You and I have not met before, but let me just piggyback on Etienne's comment. We are in the process of exporting Canadian ingenuity of a net 0 point perspective to a country that's potentially in the middle of a conflict-ridden zone, to Romania that has already bought 2 CANDO reactors in the 90s and in the 2000s, and they're very interested to get off coal, and they need 2 more CANDO reactors. And so we're in active discussions with the utility in Romania right now to see about 2 new CANDO reactors, and we're working with Export Development Canada, with US Exim Bank, with the Italians and the French to try and put these, to use Canadian ingenuity, so to speak, and to put in these 2 new reactors so they can stay off coal and not use Russian gas, and actually help with energy diversification, geopolitical stability, and actually also help Romania reach its 2030 objectives, for which they have to be totally off coal by somewhat similar to our country. So it is working. Thank you very much, Etienne, for the plug. Perhaps your collective, your individual perspectives on what you're doing in your organizations to reach your net zero objectives as a kind of an all panel type question. What are you doing to contribute to the net zero agenda in Canada? And what do you think are the most promising opportunities for collaboration with government in order to help with civil society to reach our net zero objectives? And Shelley, why don't we just go right down? And Shelley, let's start with you.
You're giving the person that probably has the easiest job for net zero. We're a white collar knowledge service. If you make business travel really hard and you take away the printers, our net zero target gets met relatively easily compared to some of my colleagues in the room. That said, we're
Still scope 3.
it's still
The scope 3.
we one of the roles that we play at PwC is working with many of the business leaders in this room and with our public sector partners, in some cases convening them for things that aren't actually, an engagement for PwC, but bringing together perspectives to help people try and put those resources to what I'll call the long poles in the tent. If we can get more people focused on the longest poles and knocking them out, then we can focus sort of on the individual interests that are there. And I'm really proud of the work that we're doing ourselves. I mean, it's important, I think, to contribute in forums like this and for us to bring the kind of either research capability, economics that we can share with others to be able to advance and accelerate what you're each trying to do in the real economy.
Thanks. And Rob, we talked about decarbonizing cement over lunch. Very interesting subject. What's Lafarge doing to help Canada reach its net zero objectives?
I think, I looked at 5 years ago, and we represented about 1% of the world's CO2 emissions as a company at that time. Canada is now 1.3. So we have a real opportunity to make a world difference, like a world of difference around the globe. Where I'm focused on, our company is going to be focused on, other than some of the investments we are planning to make in the near future, is getting the numbers right. Call it carbon accounting, if you like, or governance. If you're asking us today how much carbon, how many kilograms of carbon was emitted in that cubic meter on that truck, I'll have to give you a range. I can't give you an actual number. And the way I calculate it, the way another company might calculate it will be different. And even with environmental product declarations, they're plus or minus 20, 30% to this date. So in order to make carbon a commercial quantity that governments can then purchase lower carbon concretes in a secure way that they know that they're getting what they paid for, there's a lot of work that has to happen. And I think that's going to be a main focus for me personally this year, but also for our company getting the numbers right.
Thank you very much. And Rebecca?
Rob, that's a great segue into our side of things. So for everyone that maybe is less familiar with the investment and the asset management side of things, our scope 3 are the emissions of every single company that we invest in. So you have to think building a climate strategy around that is very difficult. Making sure the numbers are right is very difficult. Making sure that the reporting is there and understanding the climate action plans of the companies that we invest in is also very difficult. So it makes every day just as exciting and interesting and different. So for us, what we're doing at Mackenzie is we are committed and a member to the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. So that means that we do have a 2030 interim target of how we plan to reduce our carbon footprint of our investee companies. So you have to think that's not something that we can just flip a switch at Mackenzie and do. It's very heavily requires engagement and stewardship with our investee companies. So that means making sure that our investee companies have clear climate action plans and that we can try to basically make sure we can have as much impact as an asset manager as we can. Also making sure that our clients and the asset owners understand, okay, how do we calculate this? What's going on? What is our carbon footprint? So there's a lot of kind of hand holding, I think, within this, making sure our portfolio managers understand how to manage for climate risk when that's not something that has been commonly used within financial analysis, right? Like everything's been very focused, okay, on alpha and how do we generate alpha? What are these companies doing that is great, and less so focused on, okay, do we look always at their sustainability reports and their ESG reports, and do we need to engage on this further? Are those numbers actually right? So there definitely is a very, very big collaborative approach that we have to take. At Mackenzie, we've taken a little bit of a back end approach, and we are really leaning into the engagement and stewardship side of things, investing with our top 100 emitters that actually make up 70% of our carbon footprint. So we think that if we can encourage these 100 companies to get forth strong climate action plans that consider, okay, their carbon performance, their management performance, as well as the feasibility, okay, how are we going to get there? What incentives are out there that we can hopefully make an impact? And then on the other side of things, because we are asset managers, we need to make sure that we have the right types of solutions out there to the market. So whether that's having green bonds and sustainability linked bond funds that are out there, having thematic facing funds that really focus on the green economy, but then also making sure that any of our regular kind of responsible investment funds also consider climate change within it. It's a big challenge, but I think we're up for it, or at least I'm up for it, which is great. But again, the organization is a lot more than just me. So really on that knowledge sharing side of things is what we're focusing on now.
Thanks. And Etienne, as Clean Prosperity, obviously a lot of collaboration going on with your organization, with other stakeholders. Your perspective, please.
Yeah, absolutely. 4 panelists, 4 very different approaches. Being a 9-person remote first organization, I don't know that it's a very big consequence in terms of our scope 3 emissions, for instance. Where we try and have our impact is in terms of partnering both with government as well as industry to talk about the best approaches to decarbonization for the Canadian economy. From day to day, that looks very different. From month to month, it does as well. 8 months ago, we wouldn't have been talking about the IRA and the significance of the IRA because it didn't exist yet. The IRA is something that came together very quickly. One of the reports we put out recently that some folks in this room might find of interest was comparing IRA incentives in Canada versus the United States to make the case for different ITCs or PTCs and where the role of the federal government would be. That's the kind of work that we're going to keep doing. Next year, it might not be about the IRA, it might be about something else. Contracts for difference is one of the phrases that everyone is kind of talking about when they're talking about business certainty. Fairly convoluted if you're not familiar with the concept, but effectively it's a policy for the federal government to backstop either the headline carbon credit price or the carbon price schedule rather, or third production. But it's these kinds of policies that we do our work on. We provide research, we partner with industry. So if that is of interest to anyone, our doors are always open and we're always looking for opportunities to work together.
Thank you. And perhaps a follow-on question on collaboration. It's been a big theme this morning and all throughout this discussion. The federal government has started collaboration exercises related to certain pathways, sector-specific collaborative pathways. I'm just wondering if I could get a quick perspective from you with respect to the launch. They do seem to be public-private sector oriented. They're going to hopefully be granular in scope, but I'm just wondering to get your perspective on this next level of collaboration that's underway or about to be underway. Shelley, yeah.
I'm excited by the next level, particularly when it's more granular. I think where the rubber hits the road though, Sam, and where it's going to get challenging is you have to bring it back together and knit it together up top again. So you need those, we're not a country that I think one pathway would ever make sense. So we need many pathways, which I'm very supportive of. And we need to do that at a level of detail that's meaningful. But when we think about how do you reintegrate that in terms of the things that are required to support multiple of those pathways again, I think that's going to be the next logical step in it. But I'm very encouraged by the sector pathways
Top
consultation.
Down, bottom up and top down. Any other?
Everything everywhere all at once. I'm going to steal Aaron's line.
Anyone else would like to comment on the upcoming sector-specific collaborations that are going to take place? Rob?
Well, I can talk a bit about ours. We're the first sector to put a net zero roadmap together with the support of ISED, and it's been a very powerful exercise for us. I was sat on very long Zoom calls as we looked at different components of our plan. What it does is frame our net zero strategy for our entire industry. It also brings the government in so they understand our net zero strategy and they understand the role that they can play in various parts where our partner agencies like the concrete ready mix organizations, the concrete pipe partners, even other related partners such as the manufacturers of our ready mix trucks, for example. They all have a role to play. And now through that roadmap, it's the numbers are squishy because we're looking out 20, 30 years and we're making assumptions, but it gives us a structure to plan our investments and also our strategy with government. The biggest thing that government can do for us right now is to buy low carbon products and put a premium on them and work with us on what's called performance standards. And the last thing I'll say is Canada is very good at fundamental research. We aren't very good at commercialization. And one of the biggest issues is we don't buy our own innovative products. So something that government can work on.
Amen, brother, once again. So anyone else would like to provide a perspective? Oh, Rebecca.
Just quickly, I was just going to say that having any of this nitty-gritty detail is great because, again, it helps add that roadmap, but it helps from the side of validity and what is enough and what's kind of the fair share. So I'm not sure if anyone else here works for an asset manager, but when you're putting forth your NZAM target, they say to you that it has to be aligned with what your fair share is as an organization. And if you ask a company what their fair share is, it is very hard to come up with an answer for that, right? Because you can have your own personal values of what's a fair share. Your company could have their own perspective. And basically, ultimately, a lot of people are basing it off of, okay, at least in Canada, what's Canada doing? What's the fair share of these sectors? And then how do we make plans off of that? So for us, it adds quite a bit more guidance in this space. And if we're engaging with our companies, we can say, okay, are you doing enough? Or are you not doing it enough? And it's not just kind of coming up with a number that we think is enough. It's actually kind of adds to the accountability side of it.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have a burning question at this point that they would like to ask of these very esteemed panelists? If not, I just want to maybe repeat the themes of both Aaron, Corey, and these panelists. Money, time, pace, urgency, people, diversity, and collaboration. We all need that in order to reach this target of various degrees. And hopefully you've found this this entire session, as well as the previous session, stimulating to that effect. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons before 4 o'clock as you watch the budget, I suppose. And good luck to all of you as you all reach your net zero targets. Thank you.